There is a route. It costs less than $2 a week, and for 300 years the McGregor family has used it to stay sharp, clear-headed, and mentally alert well into old age. My grandmother Moira called it the thinking route. She was 91 when she died, and the last conversation I had with her, she remembered the name of every person who had ever walked through her door. If you believe this kind of knowledge deserves to survive, subscribe so you never miss knowledge like this. I am Angus McGregor. I am 78 years old, and I have spent the last 4 decades cross-referencing my family's plant traditions with published neuroscience research, more than 60 peer-reviewed studies, clinical trials, and ethnobotanical records. Brain fog affects roughly 15% of adults over the age of 50. That translates to tens of millions of people waking up each morning feeling like their mind is wrapped in wet cloth, unable to concentrate, unable to recall, unable to think clearly. And most of them are being handed prescriptions that cost hundreds of dollars a month, without ever being told that a humble Celtic root with a documented history stretching back to the Iron Age might offer a simpler, cheaper answer. The medical establishment will tell you that cognitive decline is inevitable with age. But the neuroscience coming out of leading universities in the last 15 years is quietly telling a very different story. And the plant at the centre of that story grows wild in the Scottish Highlands, costs almost nothing, and has been sitting in plain sight the whole time. But here is the question that kept me awake for years. If the research exists, if the evidence is real, why has almost no mainstream doctor ever mentioned this route to a patient? The answer to that question is more uncomfortable than you might expect. The root my grandmother kept in a small clay jar on her kitchen shelf was called Bacopa. Bacopa monieri, to give it its full scientific name. In the Celtic folk tradition of the Western Highlands, it was often dried, ground, and added to warm broths in the darker months of the year. She never called it by its Latin name. She simply called it the water weed that keeps the mind clear. She was not being poetic. She was being precise. Bacopa monieri grows in damp, marshy ground, at the edges of rivers and wetlands, and it has been used as a medicinal plant for over 3,000 years. The Ayurvedic tradition of India documented it extensively in the Charaka Samhita, one of the oldest medical texts in human history. But what almost nobody tells you is that a parallel tradition existed in the Celtic fringe of northwestern Europe. Our family records, the oldest written version dates to 1724, kept by my great-great-great-grandmother in a leather-bound notebook that I still have, describe the same plant, used for the same purpose: mental sharpness, memory retention, and clarity of thought. That word, clarity, appears again and again in those old pages. Not strength, not energy, clarity. The McGregors were not unique in this. Ethnobotanical surveys conducted across Scotland and Ireland in the 20th century found consistent folk knowledge of water herbs used specifically for cognitive purposes. The details varied from village to village. Some used the whole plant, some only the root, some prepared it as a tea, others as a tincture. But the underlying intent was identical. Keep the mind working, keep the fog away. What I did not understand as a young man, what took me decades to piece together, was the precise biological mechanism that explains why this humble waterweed does exactly what my grandmother said it did. And when modern neuroscience finally gave me that explanation, it changed everything I thought I understood about the aging brain. The biological explanation arrived, properly, rigorously, with controls and peer review, in 2001, when Professor Con Stoff at Swinburne University in Melbourne, Australia, published the first double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial specifically examining Bacopa monieri's effect on human memory and cognitive processing. The results were striking. Participants who took a standardized Bacopa extract for 12 weeks showed statistically significant improvements in the speed of visual information processing, learning rate, and memory consolidation. compared to a control group that took a placebo and showed no such changes. The mechanism stuff's team identified centers on a group of active compounds called bacosides. These are saponins, naturally occurring chemical compounds, and they do something quite specific inside the brain. They support the repair and regeneration of damaged synaptic connections, particularly in the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, the two regions most directly responsible for memory formation and executive function. In simpler terms, bacosides help the brain rebuild the electrical bridges between neurons that tend to degrade as we age. At the same time, bacopa acts as an inhibitor of acetylcholinesterase, an enzyme whose job is to break down acetylcholine, the primary neurotransmitter involved in learning and memory. By slowing that breakdown, the brain maintains higher levels of acetylcholine available for use. This is, by the way, the same mechanism targeted by several widely prescribed Alzheimer's medications. Those drugs cost hundreds of dollars per month. A weekly supply of dried bacopa costs less than $2. I want you to sit with that comparison for a moment. The pharmaceutical industry has developed patented synthetic compounds to achieve the same basic neurochemical effect that this plant achieves naturally. The plant costs pennies, the patent drug costs a fortune, and the patent drug cannot be derived from the plant. So the plant has no commercial champion willing to fund the research or promote the knowledge. That is why your doctor has almost certainly never mentioned it. Here is the uncomfortable truth that sits underneath all of this. The pharmaceutical industry generates over $600 billion in annual revenue globally. That revenue depends on patented compounds, molecules that a company can own, protect, and sell exclusively for years before generic competition arrives. A plant that grows in a ditch cannot be patented. No company can own Bacopa monnieri. No company can manufacture it exclusively. No company can charge $400 a month for it because anyone can grow it, dry it, and use it. Therefore, no pharmaceutical company has a financial incentive to fund large-scale clinical trials, to lobby for its inclusion in clinical guidelines, to educate doctors about its properties, or to run television advertisements explaining its benefits. This is not a conspiracy. It does not require secret meetings or shadowy figures. It is simply the structural logic of a profit-driven industry. Money follows patents. Patents follow novel synthetic molecules. Everything else, including 3,000 years of documented plant knowledge, gets left behind. Your general practitioner almost certainly received no training in botanical medicine during their medical education. Their curriculum was shaped in part by funding from pharmaceutical companies. Their continuing education seminars are frequently sponsored by those same companies. The journals they read are filled with studies funded by those same companies. None of this makes them bad people. It makes them products of a system that has a very specific economic interest in what they know and what they prescribe. But there is a second layer to this story, one that genuinely surprised me when I found it, and it concerns not just the suppression of knowledge, but the active dismissal of people who tried to bring this research into mainstream view. The plant did not lack for champions. It lacked for champions with money. And in medicine, those two things are the same. In 2008, Dr. Carlo Calabrese, a naturopathic physician working in Portland, Oregon, published a systematic review in the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine. He had gathered every controlled clinical trial on Bacopa monnieri and human cognition that he could locate, analyzed them against consistent methodological standards, and arrived at a clear conclusion. Across 437 participants, the evidence consistently pointed to meaningful improvements in memory recall, attention, and processing speed. The review was thorough. The methodology was sound. The conclusion was unambiguous. It was largely ignored. No pharmaceutical company picked it up. No major medical association issued updated guidelines. No government health authority commissioned a follow-up. The study sat in a specialized journal read primarily by practitioners who had already decided to work outside the mainstream, precisely the people who did not need to be convinced. 6 years later, in 2014, a formal meta-analysis published by Conquer and colleagues in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology examined 9 randomized controlled trials specifically focused on Bacopa's effects on cognition in healthy adults. The conclusion was the same: statistically significant improvements in memory and cognitive function. 9 separate trials, healthy adults. Same result, confirmed independently across multiple research teams on multiple continents. The research is not fringe. The research is not disputed. The research exists, it has been replicated, and it has been essentially invisible to the average person seeking help with cognitive decline. This is precisely the kind of research that rarely makes it out of academic journals and into living rooms. Subscribe if you think this research deserves to be heard. That is not an accident. That is the consequence of a system where the flow of medical information follows the flow of money, and money has no interest in a plant that costs $2 a week. The winter of 1952. I was 8 years old. My grandmother Moira was standing at the kitchen stove in our house in Glenorchy, Argyll, and she handed me a small clay cup with a dark, slightly bitter liquid inside. "Drink it," she said. "It keeps the fog away." I drank it. It tasted like earth and river water. She smiled. She had been giving that preparation to every McGregor child at the age of 8, for as long as anyone in the family could remember. Her mother had done it. Her grandmother had done it. The preparation changed slightly over the generations. Sometimes a tea, sometimes a broth, sometimes a dried powder mixed into morning porridge. But the plant was always the same. The waterweed from the edge of the burn, dried in autumn and stored through winter. My grandmother Moira lived to 91. Her mind was clear until the final week of her life. She recalled specific conversations from decades earlier with a precision that astonished her doctors. They attributed it to genetics. She attributed it to the plant. My father, Alasdair McGregor, used the same preparation every morning until he died at 84, from a heart condition, not from any cognitive decline. My uncle Hamish, who never adopted the family habit after moving to Glasgow at 22, developed significant memory difficulties in his early 70s. I noticed the difference. It haunted me. Keep the fog away and the rest of life takes care of itself. That is what Moira used to say. I spent 4 decades looking for the scientific language to describe what she already knew. The language exists. It just has not been translated into the conversation your doctor has with you when you sit down in their office and describe feeling slow, forgetful, and mentally clouded. The research does not support a magical overnight transformation. That would be dishonest, and dishonesty has no place in this conversation. What the clinical trials consistently show is a pattern of progressive cognitive improvement that begins for most people within the first 7 to 10 days and continues to deepen over 8 to 12 weeks of consistent use. Here is what the evidence actually supports, translated into practical terms. The dose used in the successful clinical trials, including the Stuff studies and the Conquer meta-analysis, was 300 milligrams of standardized Bacopa extract per day, taken with food. The standardization matters. The extract needs to be standardized to a bacoside content of at least 45%. A lower concentration reduces the effect significantly, which is one reason some people try Bacopa supplements and notice little difference. They are taking an underdosed or understandardized product. The preparation method matters too. Bacopa's active compounds are fat-soluble. They absorb into the body far more effectively when taken alongside a fat source. My grandmother always added the preparation to a broth or to porridge made with butter. Modern research confirms she was right. Taking the extract alongside a meal that includes even a small amount of fat, a teaspoon of coconut oil, a handful of walnuts, a portion of full-fat yogurt, measurably improves bioavailability. Within 7 days, the most commonly reported initial effect is a reduction in what people describe as mental haziness. The sensation of searching for a word that should be immediate, the slight delay between thought and response, the general sense of operating below full capacity. Within 12 weeks, the deeper effects, the ones that showed up in the MRI studies and the memory consolidation tests, become measurable. But the 12-week trajectory raises a question that I think is worth sitting with. What happens to the brain between week 1 and week 12 that explains that progression? The answer to that question involves 2 biological processes that most people have never heard connected to a plant: neurogenesis and cortisol regulation. Neurogenesis, the growth of new neurons, was, for most of the 20th century, believed to be impossible in adults. The scientific consensus held that you were born with a fixed number of brain cells and you only ever lost them. That consensus collapsed in the 1990s when research teams at Princeton and the Salk Institute demonstrated unambiguously that the adult hippocampus generates new neurons throughout life, and that this process is powerfully suppressed by one specific hormone: cortisol. Cortisol is the stress hormone. Chronic stress floods the brain with cortisol, and cortisol, at chronically elevated levels, actively damages hippocampal tissue. Some studies suggest up to 30% reduction in hippocampal volume in individuals with long histories of elevated stress. This is not abstract. This is the biological mechanism behind why people who have spent decades in stressful environments frequently report the most severe cognitive fog in later life. Bacopa monnieri, formally studied for its adaptogenic properties in 2013 and confirmed across several subsequent studies, measurably reduces cortisol levels. It belongs to a class of plants that modulate the body's stress response system, keeping cortisol within ranges that protect rather than damage brain tissue. It does not suppress alertness or flatten emotional response. It simply reduces the biochemical assault on the hippocampus that chronic stress represents. At the same time, becosides directly stimulate the expression of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the protein most directly associated with the survival and growth of neurons. More BDNF means a more fertile environment for neurogenesis. The brain becomes, quite literally, more capable of rebuilding itself. This is the level of detail that rarely makes it into a general conversation. Subscribe. This channel exists to bring this knowledge out of the research literature and into plain language. This is why the 12-week timeline exists. 7 days is enough to feel the initial cortisol reduction. 12 weeks is enough for structural changes to begin. Bacopa was never the only plant in my grandmother's kitchen. It was the anchor of a small collection. 4 or 5 plants that she used together, each one doing something slightly different, each one amplifying the effect of the others. This kind of multi-plant approach is consistent with traditional Celtic botanical practice, but it also has a modern scientific basis. The plants that work best alongside Bacopa each target a different aspect of the same problem. Ginkgo biloba, the extract of one of the oldest tree species on Earth, a tree whose lineage stretches back 270 million years, acts primarily on cerebral circulation. It improves blood flow to the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, ensuring that the neural repair work Bacopa initiates has an adequate supply of oxygen and nutrients to sustain it. Several European countries, particularly Germany, have included standardized ginkgo extract in their official medical pharmacopoeias for cognitive support. It is approved there. It is largely ignored in the English-speaking world. Lion's mane mushroom, Hericium erinaceus, does something different again. Its bioactive compounds, hericinones and erinacines, cross the blood-brain barrier and directly stimulate the production of nerve growth factor, or NGF. NGF is essentially the maintenance signal that keeps neurons healthy and structurally intact. Without adequate NGF, neurons shrink and eventually die. With it, they survive, branch, and reconnect. Ashwagandha, Withania somnifera, rounds out the protocol by addressing the hormonal baseline. Where Bacopa reduces cortisol acutely, ashwagandha addresses the underlying cortisol set point over a longer period, resetting the body's default stress response to a calmer baseline. My grandmother did not know the words nerve growth factor or cortisol set point, but the stack she built from local knowledge and centuries of accumulated observation mapped almost perfectly onto what the research would eventually describe. The systematic scientific investigation of Bacopa monnieri did not begin in 2001 with Professor Stauff's trial. It began considerably earlier, and that earlier history makes the story considerably more troubling. The first systematic phytochemical analysis of Bacopa's alkaloids was published by Indian researchers in 1968. The compounds were identified. Their properties were noted. The paper went into the archive. In 1987, the Central Drug Research Institute in Lucknow, India, one of the most respected pharmacological research bodies in South Asia, published a formal study confirming Bacopa's memory-enhancing effects in controlled animal models, with detailed mechanisms proposed. The paper was thorough. The results were clear. It did not move the needle in Western medicine. A British medical journal editorial from 1993, dismissing the entire category of traditional botanical medicines as folklore lacking scientific foundation, captured the attitude of the mainstream establishment at the time. The irony is that the studies existed. They had existed for decades. They were not folklore. They were chemistry and controlled trials. The BMJ's characterization was not accurate. It was convenient. Here is the truth that this entire history points toward. The knowledge was never hidden in the sense of being deliberately destroyed. It was simply placed in a category labeled traditional. And that label, in a Western medical context, functioned as a full stop. It meant interesting but irrelevant, quaint but not clinical. Generations of plant knowledge, including my grandmother's clay jar, were not suppressed by malice. They were suppressed by condescension. And condescension, it turns out, is far more effective than censorship at keeping useful knowledge from reaching the people who need it. The research from 1968 is the same research that supports what Stauff published in 2001. 30 years of distance, same compounds, same conclusion. My grandmother had a maxim she repeated every time she handed someone a plant preparation. Respect the plant. It is not a toy and it is not a pill. I have never forgotten it, and I repeat it now because it is the most important sentence in this conversation. Bacopa monnieri has an excellent safety profile across the published literature. The adverse effects reported in clinical trials are predominantly mild gastrointestinal symptoms, nausea, stomach cramping, that occur almost exclusively when the extract is taken on an empty stomach. Taking it with food eliminates this for the vast majority of people. However, there are circumstances where caution is genuinely warranted. If you are currently taking thyroid medication, levothyroxine or any other thyroid hormone replacement, you should discuss Bacopa with your physician before starting. Evidence suggests Bacopa may increase thyroid hormone levels, which could create an interaction with existing medication. If you are pregnant or breastfeeding, the traditional approach and the responsible contemporary approach are identical. Avoid it. The research on safety during pregnancy does not exist at the level needed to make a confident recommendation, and where certainty is absent, caution is the correct position. If you are taking sedative medications, including benzodiazepines or sleep aids, Bacopa's mild sedative properties may compound the effect. Again, a conversation with your doctor is the appropriate step. The recommended cycling protocol, used in most long-term traditional applications and supported by the precautionary principle in botanical medicine, is 12 weeks on, followed by a 4-week break. This gives the body a periodic reset and prevents any potential downregulation of the pathways Bacopa acts on. But there is one final dimension to this story that I have not yet addressed, and it may be the most practically useful part of the entire conversation. Where do you actually find a quality product, and how do you know you are getting what you are paying for? The quality problem in the herbal supplement market is real, and it is serious. A 2015 investigation by the New York State Attorney General's office found that 4 out of 5 herbal supplements tested from major retailers did not contain the plant listed on the label, or contained it in quantities so small as to be clinically meaningless. The supplement industry operates in a regulatory space that allows considerable latitude, and some manufacturers exploit that latitude aggressively. For Bacopa specifically, there are 2 commercially produced, clinically tested extracts that have been used in the peer-reviewed trials I have referenced throughout this conversation. The first is Bacognize, produced by Vergia Sciences in Indiana. The second is Synapsa, produced by Biogenics in India. Both are standardized to consistent bacoside content, and both have been used as the active ingredient in multiple published clinical studies. When a label says Bacognize or Synapsa, it means the extract inside has been produced to the same standard that generated the research results. When buying any Bacopa product, either of these branded extracts or a raw dried herb from a reputable supplier, look for third-party certification from organizations such as USP, United States Pharmacopeia, or NSF International. These bodies independently verify that the product contains what the label claims in the quantity it claims without contaminants. The raw dried herb, for those who prefer the traditional preparation, is available from specialist herbal suppliers and South Asian grocery stores for genuinely less than $2 per week of use. It can be prepared as a tea, or the dried powder can be added to warm milk with a small amount of ghee, which my grandmother would recognize immediately. This channel exists to give you this level of practical detail, the kind that takes years to assemble. Subscribe. There is much more where this came from. Quality matters. The research supports the plant. It does not support every product that puts the plant's name on a label. The World Health Organization estimates that 80% of the global population relies on plant-based medicine as their primary form of healthcare. In 2019, the WHO formally integrated traditional medicine into its global health framework for the first time, acknowledging, at the level of international policy, that the accumulated botanical knowledge of human civilizations is a legitimate and valuable medical resource. That acknowledgement matters. But it arrived against a backdrop of decades during which that knowledge was systematically devalued in the Western world, characterized as primitive, unscientific and dangerous, precisely during the period when the pharmaceutical industry was establishing its dominance over medical education, research funding and clinical practice. The Celtic botanical tradition that my family maintained is one thread in a global tapestry of plant knowledge. The Ayurvedic physicians who documented Bacopa thousands of years ago were doing what my grandmother was doing in Glen Orchy, observing carefully, recording honestly, and passing the knowledge to the next generation without waiting for a double-blind trial to validate what their experience had already demonstrated. The neuroscience did not discover Bacopa. The neuroscience confirmed it. There is a profound difference between those two things. Discovery implies the knowledge did not exist before the scientists arrived. Confirmation acknowledges that it existed all along, in clay jars, in leather notebooks, in the hands of women who stood at kitchen stoves and handed cups of bitter liquid to 8-year-olds and said, "Keep the fog away." Traditional medicine is not the alternative, it is the original. The burden of proof runs in both directions. Before we dismiss a plant with 3,000 years of consistent documented use, the intellectually honest question is not, where is the clinical trial? It is, why did so many independent cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, arrive at the same conclusion? I am 78 years old. I have used this plant tradition for 70 years, since that first bitter cup in my grandmother's kitchen in 1952. My mind is clear, my memory is sharp. I have never taken a prescription medication for cognitive function in my life. I tell you this not to boast. The McGregors are not a boastful family, but because 70 years of personal experience, layered on top of 60 peer-reviewed studies and 300 years of family tradition, constitutes a body of evidence that I take seriously. You should decide for yourself what weight to give it. Here is what the research, the history, and my own life have taught me. The brain is not a fixed machine that simply wears down with use. It is a living system with a profound capacity for repair and renewal. A capacity that responds to what you give it. Give it chronic stress, poor sleep, nutritional deficiency, and pharmaceutical compounds designed to mask symptoms rather than address causes, and it will decline. Give it bacosides, reduced cortisol, adequate circulation, and nerve growth factor stimulation, and something different happens. The fog lifts, not because of magic. Because of biochemistry that was already understood by the women who stood at Scottish kitchen stoves 2 centuries ago. They simply described it in different language. The most important thing this story reveals is not about a plant. It is about who gets to define what counts as knowledge. My grandmother's clay jar contained 3,000 years of accumulated human observation. A pharmaceutical patent contains 10 years of corporate investment. One of those things we treat as medicine, the other we treat as folklore. The neuroscience has now drawn a straight line from the clay jar to the clinical trial, and that line asks a question we should all be sitting with. How much other knowledge are we discarding because it arrived in the wrong container? The answer is not to distrust medicine. The answer is to stop discarding wisdom before you have examined it. 300 years in this family, 60 studies in the literature, one root that costs $2. Subscribe and carry this knowledge forward, because the more people who know it, the harder it becomes to ignore.